I've asked Warren if he would start us with a prayer. So once everybody's situated, we'll go ahead and have the opening prayer and then move right into class. Brother Warren? Amen. Thank you. All right, so we left off, last week at the Western Wall Tunnel. I described the Western Wall to you, also known as the Wailing Wall, and why it is that what they do there at that wall, the Jews that is today, and what that represents. I have kind of an overview map. You can see on your left there the city of Jerusalem. I have been able to kind of make my mouse a little larger, so you should be able to see it. The western wall would be this area here. This is the entire western wall of the temple complex. You can see up here, this would be the actual temple itself. And so the western wall tunnel goes from about where you see this bridge area here all the way to the northwest corner of the Temple Mount complex. So that's where we left off there, and I will, when we get to the southern steps, show you some additional stuff from this map. But I want to go back to where we were last week. I showed you, let me just back up one slide here, or two slides actually. I showed you this large stone that went across there. It's like almost a foundation stone. Actually, it's a little bit higher than the foundation stone. It's been identified as being during the Second Temple period, which would have been the temple period where Herod the Great rebuilt the temple complex. You see these little holes that are cut out in that. Those were actually added sometime later. And the reason for that is we move into, let me skip that slide. The reason for that is they would attach things to the actual wall, the western wall, and so they would put wood almost like 2x4s in there, and then they would attach whatever it was to that wall, whether it be another building or some type of shopping area or whatever else. So you can see here, I've kind of shown you a picture of what one of those pieces of wood would have looked like. This base stone here would have been added after the fact and attached to the wall through these wooden beams that were attached to the actual foundation stones. So that gives you an idea. That was actually done after the fact, after the Jesus' time period, and after several of the destructions of that area have occurred, and they would add additional areas. Also here on the right-hand side is another picture with, this is a plexiglass floor, and you're looking down to street level, first century. And so we're about, where I took this photograph is, I'm about 30 feet underground where modern day street level is. And you can see how much further down, it's probably another 50 or 60 feet down to where first century street level would be. So as you can imagine, there is quite a bit of dirt and debris all around Jerusalem that's covering much of this area. And so that's why archaeology continues modern day today. You go there to the city of Jerusalem and you will see excavation sites that are going on today. In fact, I showed you some when we looked at the city of David. There's current excavation going on there today. Most recently, just a couple years ago, there was excavation at the Temple Mount area that identified some things that hadn't been identified before, including the signs. The signposts, they're not wooden signs, but they're stone signs that would have been in the Temple Mount area that said that Gentiles were not allowed past a certain point, and those were just recently discovered. When we get to the southern steps, I'll share with you some other recent discoveries that I think are very important for us theologically speaking as Christians, and we'll discuss that when we get to it. So, also in the Western Wall Tunnel, this is towards the end of the tunnel, you can see there that you've got some pillars that are actually located in there, and we can see from from this pillar over here on this side, I'm circling, this is a zoomed in area of that particular pillar. There's this little nub that's there that you don't see on the pillar to the left. That little nub would ultimately, once they put the pillar in place, should have been cut off and ultimately would have been sanded down or it would look just like the rest of the pillar. And it was used to help move the pillar into place and to carry the pillar. And so those nubs would have been around the pillars. Once they were put in place, they were taken off. So this helps us to understand that this pillar was put in place and ultimately the nub was left there, probably because about the time it was put in place would have been around the time the destruction of Jerusalem. So 70 A.D., some 40 years after Jesus was crucified on the cross. So it gives you an idea, and this again would be first century street level. You can't really see it. Hopefully I can help describe it for you. This wood, or excuse me, this stone that's in between the pillars and along the different sides would have been added later. These would have been pillars into a shopping area. So people on the modern day street level would go into these shops and they would purchase items just outside of the temple complex. We have read about times where Jesus was in the Temple Mount and he actually cast out the money changers. Well, this is the area they should have been in if they were going to be doing those things. But instead, they were up in the actual Temple Mount area and in an area of the temple itself where they shouldn't have been. So this is street level. You look down at the floor there, or the ground. Those are first century paving stones. Would have been there during the time of Jesus. Now, as you walk through Jerusalem and you go to the different sites, it is today a tourist attraction, and many people from around the world go there because a lot of different religions are represented in just this very city. I've shown you how Muslim controls currently the Temple Mount area. You have the modern day Jews that are still utilizing the Western Wall for various purposes. And then you have Christians throughout the world that go to these areas as well to view where the disciples, where Jesus walked and those kind of things. So as you go about there, you will several times hear at different locations, this is a position where Jesus may have been at. Well, this is a position where Jesus may have actually stood at along the western wall of the temple area. We know that he spent some time around the temple. We read about the different accounts that he had in the temple itself, and so that gives you an idea of where it is. We can't say for certain, obviously, but certainly you can imagine that Jesus and the apostles would have been in this area at least. Robert.
The badge that I had, this is 40, 50 years ago, but the mantra was according to tradition. So you got to take everything as 6 grains of salt.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that, especially when we get to what I'm going to term the Passion Week, and we talk about the location of the crucifixion and the location of Jesus' burial. They were both in the same area, but there are two areas, there are two specific sites that are both according to tradition. Both of them are according to the tradition. I'll show you both of those, and I'll give you some information that will not be definitive, but it might help you to decide which one is more likely the area where Jesus would have been crucified and buried at. All right, so here we see an actual broken paving stone in the photograph on the left. Again, this would be a first century stone. You can see based on the comparison of the feet there how large and how thick it is. That would have been at street level, placed in front of these shop areas at the base of the western wall of the temple towards the north side. Now again, all of this is underground now, and it was just a few years ago that they dug out the western tunnel and made it available for people to be able to access. So just 50 years ago, you couldn't go into the western wall tunnel and see it, and now today you can see how the stones are there. Off to the photograph on the left is actually a first century stone that hasn't been placed yet. It was sitting alongside of these other street areas. Again, a good indication that it was probably placed there sometime around the time that Jerusalem would have been destroyed. because it would have been placed and it would have been mortared into place using the techniques that they used in the first century. And in this case, it's just sitting there, resting alongside the ground along the western wall on the northern side. All right, so that's the western wall and the western wall tunnel. Very fascinating to go and see that. Any questions about the western wall or the western wall tunnel? Yes, go ahead. Say that one more time. How far is the Wailing Wall from this Western Wall tunnel? Well, it starts at the end of the Wailing Wall. The Western Wall tunnel starts, and it goes all the way to the northwest corner of the temple complex. Tyler, I think I minimized that other one. Can you bring that back up again? There we go. Thank you. I'll show you, let me go back on the slide and I'll kind of show you on the slide an idea of where the Western Wall tunnel would be based on the diagram. Okay, so this cutout here is what we see modern day Western Wall, or what's known as the Wailing Wall. The Western Wall tunnel goes from the end of that all the way to the northwest corner of the temple complex. So to answer your question, that's how far it is. It's quite a walk to go down that way. I don't have the exact dimensions of that, but it's quite a walk to get there. Other questions about the Western Wall? Western Wall tunnel? All right, let's talk about the southern steps. The southern steps also have an important, as I mentioned a moment ago, some important theological things that I want us to be able to share. And on the southern steps is probably the most likely location where you can see a place where Jesus actually stood, and I'll show that to you in a moment. The southern steps would be located, this again is a diagram of what Old Jerusalem would have looked like during Jesus' time. We were just located along the western wall. Now we're going to be at the southern steps area of the temple area. And let me just show you, let's see, I think I have a photograph or a little map that might help you see what that might look like. Tyler, can you bring that picture around a little bit? The other way. A little more. A little more. Right about there would be good. Okay, so we just passed the southwest corner of the temple complex as he panned around. This is what they believe the southern steps would have looked like. You can see there's two entry points. You have the double gates, and then over here you have what's known today as the triple gates. We'll see some of the rebuilding of those gates. And then you see all the people would come up from the lower areas of Jerusalem. This would be the entrance for the people other than the priests into the Temple Mount area. So certainly Jesus and the disciples would have been in this area and frequented this area, and most likely the majority would enter through the triple gates, which I'll show you in just a moment. This is a picture of the southern steps today. The steps that are located here are modern steps. They wouldn't have been there during Jesus' time. These steps over here and these structures over here would have been more first century. One of the interesting things about the southern steps is the steps, some of them were close together and some were far apart. It's said that the reason that was that way is that as you walked up the steps, you would have to lean forward almost in a bowing motion, and so it was a matter of reverence that the steps were placed like that. I don't know if I believe that, especially with Herod the Great being the one that built the temple complex. He wasn't known for his religious zeal, if I could say it that way. We speculate the reasons why he put all of this time and effort was to gain the acceptance of the Jews, to create a situation where he would look good to the Roman Empire, because he's ruling that area in a way that doesn't create any controversy. But he certainly did put a lot of effort, or he at least paid for people to put in a lot of effort and time into building this complex. On this photograph, this is kind of a panoramic one, so it doesn't kind of give you, it's not curved, or the photo looks like the wall is curved. It's not. But over here, I'll just give you a little bit of an idea. Over here, you can see that's the Mount of Olives. So here from the southern steps, you can see the top of and much of the Mount of Olives. Over here would have been the city of David and the lower city of Jerusalem, which is where the non-wealthy of the Jews would have lived at, who lived in Jerusalem. And so this is the area we're going to talk about today. Again, on this map, you can see this is the eastern wall of the Temple Mount complex, the temple being right here or at least half the temple on this picture being right here. And the southern steps would be located right here. This would be the city of David. Actually, it's a little further this way, the city of David. And then down here is the lower city of Jerusalem, up here the upper city of Jerusalem. And so here you see the southern steps area. I want you to this is a picture of the model that I showed you that's in Jerusalem. A 1:50 scale model of the old city of Jerusalem during Jesus' time. As I show you some of the photographs today, I want you to notice what's not on this particular slide, what's not on many of the models today, and what I think has some very theological significance for us as Christians today. But just make note of what you see here. Big, wide, open area with these steps. You do have this little building position here, and then you have the lower parts of the city, or the upper parts of the city of David, the lower part of the city of Jerusalem. Again, another picture of that southwest corner of the southern steps. You have the triple gates there to the right, the two gates that are there to the left. It just gives you an idea and an indication of what that area would have looked like. Now, if you go there to the southern steps today, they have these little, almost like binocular things that you can look through, and they put these animated diagrams inside of the picture that you take. And so this picture on the right here is me taking a picture through that animated diagram that gives you an idea of what that wall would have potentially looked like and people that have been there. Here is a picture of the wall modern day, the photograph on the left. You can notice that there are some excavated areas here along the southern steps that we'll talk about a little bit later, but again, just make note of that as we move along. Here's a modern day picture of those triple gates. They've been sealed up. Much of the gates that enter into the Temple Mount area have been sealed. The stone that's used here is obviously some of the stone that would have come in after the destruction of the temple area. But you can see the outlining of those gates that used to be present in that area. And again, the steps that you see here on the right-hand side are more modern steps. They're not the original steps from the first century. Again, another picture. Actually, I think this is a video, yeah. So I'll just give you a little pan around in slow motion so you can see the southern steps there. You can see some of the excavated area. Off to the right there is the Mount of Olives. And so as you pan around towards the lower part would be the Kidron Valley. Then you're looking there at the modern day lower levels of the city of Jerusalem, beyond where that bus is, and then panning around back towards the north, or excuse me, towards the west here, along the southern side of that area. Where you saw that bus at, I mentioned last week there was a shooting that took place at the temple area. Where you saw that bus at is about where that shooting took place. So near the southern steps of the temple there. This is again a picture of the triple gates there on the right, and then there was another one of those binocular looking things that you could zoom in or you could look through, and you can see these diagram or these animated parts of it, so you could see what it potentially would have looked like first century. So they've outlined kind of here the stones, but you can see, if you pay close attention, you can actually see in the photograph, this is the actual temple, or the Temple Mount area, the southern wall today in the background of it. So I've got a picture right in front of the temple gates, or excuse me, the triple gates there. You can see there's an area that's outlined here, I'm outlining with, and you've got these small broken pieces of tile that are right in front of the middle of the triple gates. Here's a close-up view of that area. This is first century tile. This is probably the closest anywhere in Israel you can get to say Jesus probably stood or walked on this area. Can't say for certain, obviously. We don't know for certain, but this would have been a place, especially if he entered through the triple gates, that he potentially, which likely he would have, and if he went through the middle one, likely would have stood or walked on these particular tiles as you walk through that middle gate of the triple gates there, the southern steps or the southern wall. So just interesting to see that. This is the double gates. This is actually towards the west on the southern wall. So what would be, if you're facing the southern wall, you have the Mount of Olives to the right. This would be towards the left, back towards the city of Jerusalem. And you don't see the gates here. They've been walled in. But here you see a diagram of what those gates would have potentially looked like, the double gates that are mentioned there. Much of the ideas of the Temple Mount and what it would have looked like come from the works of Josephus, which would have been a first century historian, Jewish historian, that describes some of that. And so they can confirm that with some of the archaeology found to make a description of what it would have looked like. Robert?
I was of the opinion, strictly not that there's no place where they know Christ was, they think, according to tradition. But I think God did it that way because if they knew for certain that Christ was there, they would worship that place or build it. They always build a monument around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That would have been a sacred place.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think God wanted that, us as Christians doing that type of thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's, if we had some relics that represented where Christ stood or something that he held, we would, as humans, have a tendency to potentially worship that and treat that differently. And so I agree with that opinion. I think that's really illustrated when you get to where some of the locations where the burial took place, and I'll share that with you when we get to that. Yes, Brother Mel.
Mark, we hear of different gates in the Bible. Do these triple gates or double gates relate to any of those gates?
Yeah, I don't think on the southern steps that, I'm not sure that any of those are specifically mentioned in the Bible. I'm trying to think if one of them might be the Beautiful Gate, but I think that was on the eastern side of the Temple Mount, so I'm not sure that I'd have to look at that, but let me check and see if any of these gates would have been referenced in Scripture. I probably should have done that to begin with, and I didn't think about it. Thank you for sharing. Yes, sir, Bill. There was a certain hierarchy, and some of the gates can only be accessed by certain people. I showed you the diagrams that the double gates look like the steps lead up to that. There are some that believe now, based on some of the archaeology they found, that was actually a ramp that led to the double gates, that it came from the western side of the city, and you would walk up this ramp in almost an L shape, and then you would enter through the double gates. And so that would have potentially been the upper level people of the city of Jerusalem, which would have been the more richer areas of the city. The lower part of the city would have probably all come through the triple gates on the southern steps. There were sections of the temple, right? So we saw, I shared with you last week, there were areas Gentiles couldn't go in, but the Jews could. And then if you're a Jew and you got into that area and you were a woman, well, you couldn't go past this area. Only male Jews could go past that area. And then the male Jews would go into an area, and then if they weren't a priest, they couldn't go past the next area, right? And then the priest would be in that area, and if you weren't part of the high priest, you couldn't go past that area, right? So there were certain levels within the temple. You recall that Paul is accused of bringing Gentiles. If you go to the book of Acts, Paul is accused of bringing Gentiles into an area of the temple complex where they're not allowed, right? So that was the accusation that was made against Paul, and taking them into an area in which they were not allowed. And as I shared with you earlier and last week, they have recently found several areas where they have these signs that were made up that ultimately said, you know, if you're a Gentile, you couldn't go past this area. And I forget the exact wording, but it was something like, your life is in your own hands if you do, right? Okay, this is standing on the southern steps looking towards the south. This area here, the lower level would be the this would be the Hinnom Valley. Up here would be what's considered the lower city of Jerusalem, and then off to the right would be the upper city of Jerusalem. Lower city and upper city just have to do with the elevation, but the less affluent people would live in the lower city, and the more affluent people would live in the upper city. So even though it uses that terminology, it's referencing kind of the altitude. It ultimately actually means the lower class of society from their view would be in this area. Upper class society would be in that area. Nathan?
How far is this?
From houses? Right across the street. You can see cars right here. This is the street. Right across the street is the city of David, and there's houses that are built right there. In fact, you can't get to some of the, if you recall, I showed you the pool of Siloam, and you only see about 1/3 of the pool today because 2/3 of it is covered by ground where there's houses built on top of it. And that would be right in this region, right over here where the pool of Siloam would be. One more time. I'm sorry, I still didn't get that. The middle of town? No. Yeah, no. So this would be the eastern side of the city of Jerusalem. Now, modern day city of Jerusalem is large now. So yes, maybe modern day it might be the middle, not quite the middle. But in the time of Jesus, this would have been the extreme east end of the city. Everything would have been built well west, south, and north of the temple complex. From the Mount of Olives down, there were no homes that were built into that area. But today, there are homes. I mean, Jerusalem is a very well-populated area, so there are many homes that are there today. Again, this is a picture. Yes, yeah.
So I'm looking at the scale of the temple, and I'm realizing, this thing rivals anything that was built in Egypt at that time frame, and a lot of the stuff was built in Rome. Even the Colosseum was grand.
Yeah, I don't think the Colosseum is as big as the temple complex was. Now the temple, yes, the temple's a smaller portion of the complex. But if you think about the entire temple complex walls and that which exists today, it took a good, I think it took us 20 minutes to walk around, 15 minutes to walk around. And you literally cannot walk all the way around the temple complex because they built up. But to go from the western wall where the tunnel was and to go all the way around to the other side to what would be the northeast corner of the temple complex took about 20 minutes walking. It's not a short walk. And as I shared with you before, the walls today, they believe, are about 50 to 100 feet lower than they were in the first century. So the walls were even higher than they are today. This is the southern steps looking directly south. The Kidron Valley here connects to the Hinnom Valley. Here in this area, you see there's homes that are built here now. Remember, I showed you those photographs that all of this area was just an open area with the one little building that was located there. But as you can see, these are all walls to some complexes that existed on the southern steps of the temple. And as you pan out, you can see here, again in this zoomed out version, you've got walls here. These are all first century level walls that existed there. This is now further back, looking north to the southern steps and the southern wall. And again, I want you to notice all of these walls and area that are now been excavated. They're not open. It wasn't an open area. There were structures there. And what were these structures? Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment. Again, this is looking southern steps, looking west towards the southwest corner of the temple complex. Again, you see walled structures all the way along the southern side of the temple complex. And this is what the majority of those are. They are what's known as mikvah, or plural mikvoth. They are baptistries. There's been about 40 to 60 excavated mikvoth on the southern steps alone of the temple. All of these required what I've described to you before as living water, which means water had to flow into these areas, and they had to be able to flow out. It couldn't be stagnant. You couldn't just dig a hole and pour water in it. So you can imagine that there had to be a complex system to be able to bring that much water. Now, mind you, 40 to 60 is all they've found thus far. And just 20 years ago, they didn't know about very many of these at all. So here we are modern day, and we realize that they've had all of these mikvoth that were along the southern steps. We don't really know what's along the northern side of the temple. Much of that area is destroyed. The eastern side now is all covered in burial sites, as I showed you last week. The western side's all been modernized, and so who knows how many mikvoth have been found in those, would have been found in those areas, or could be found if they dug up those areas. There potentially could be more. In fact, there's been up to 150 that are located in and around the temple itself. Some of them in private homes, some of them in public areas, but you have all of these washing pools or immersion pools that existed. You can see from the diagram there's like a center divide. You would go down the steps on one side, you would be fully immersed in water, and then you would come up the steps on the other side. The thought being, I was unclean when I went down on this side, so I want to go up the clean side. I don't want to go up the same way in which I went. This sign, and by the way, this sign is located at the southern steps of the temple complex. Here's what it says. The person immersing in a mikvah had to follow two rules without which the immersion was not valid for purification. The naked body had to be clean, even from dust on their feet before immersion, and the body had to be immersed entirely at once, not limb by limb. And then they quote from the Babylonian Talmud, there must be no interposition between his flesh and the water. In other words, full immersion. Some people have questioned, well, how did the apostles in Acts chapter 2 baptize 3,000 people? Well, if we just use 40 to 60 mikvah or mikvoth, it wouldn't take very long at all to baptize. In fact, you wouldn't have to go very far. Because you recall the sermon there was in what's known as Solomon's Portal. As soon as you entered the Temple Mount area, you were in Solomon's Portal from the southern steps. Here is what one of those excavated mikvoth look like. You can see from the picture here how tall it is. There's still about 3 more steps to go all the way down. I think I shared with you that while I was in there, I reached my hand up and could not touch the top. These would have been filled with water and been able to fully immerse themselves in water. Now, the question might be, why is this happening? We don't read anywhere in the Old Testament about immersion pools that existed around the Temple Mount. Why is it that the Jews are... Why is it they built all of these and they used all of this time and effort to bring water into this area around the temple complex? Well, here's the traditional thought. Before you enter a place where God was, you got to be clean. And so they're about to go into the temple complex, and again, the majority of people obviously using the southern steps of the temple would be probably one of the most populated areas around the Temple Mount. They would have to be clean before they made their way into the temple area. And so they would fully immerse themselves in water. So I share this with you because I want you to understand baptism wasn't new to the first century church. It wasn't the case that John the Baptist came around and he's the first person that ever baptized. Like many things that we find in Christianity, there was an Old Testament or an Old Covenant portion of it, and this is the Old Covenant portion of baptism. Now, here's what they believed. They believed you had to have physically clean flesh in order to go into the temple. So they washed themselves physically. If you have your Bibles, turn over to 1 Peter 3:21.
Mark, one of the explanations I heard there was that if you were a Gentile and wanting to become a Jew, you could do it, but you had to be baptized. And that was a similar type of thing. You washed off the Gentile and you became a Jew.
I hadn't heard that, but that's interesting that they certainly believed in immersion pools, right? And it comes from Old Testament language that you had to be clean in order to do certain things. And in fact, this morning in my sermon, I'm going to talk about a leper that's going to approach Jesus. And you recall from the Old Testament that somebody that had leprosy, before they could come into the camp, before they could be around other people, they had to be cleaned. Right? And so if they had leprosy, that first had to be gone. And then once that leprosy was gone, they had to fully immerse themselves in water before they could actually enter into the camp. And so that kind of thought process permeated its way into the Jewish society during Jesus' time, and that you had to be physically clean in order to enter into the presence where God was. Notice 1 Peter 3:21. Says, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of filth from the flesh, but an appeal of a good conscience to God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'd always wondered why Peter had placed not the removal of filth of the flesh into that passage. I have a better understanding now. Because the Jews believed in order to come into the presence of God, you had to physically remove the filth of the flesh before you could enter into the Temple Mount area. And here in 1 Peter 3:21, Peter's saying that's not what Christian baptism is. It's not a removal of filth of the flesh. It's an answer of a good conscience towards God, corresponding to the salvation that Noah and his family received through the ark, or through water from the ark. So I bring this up because I think it has very, very theological significance, especially in the Christian world today, that minimizes the importance of baptism. By the way, I just read you a verse that says baptism saves you. 1 Peter 3:21. Had a conversation with somebody who didn't believe baptism saves you. Asked them to read that verse. I've shared that experience with you before, but after that discussion, I asked him, I showed you a verse that says baptism saves you. Where's your verse that says baptism doesn't? Where's the verse that says baptism doesn't? Now, I want us to understand that just because two verses say the exact opposite doesn't mean theologically that God has contradicted himself. There's an explanation. But if there's no verse that exists anywhere in the Bible that says baptism doesn't save you, how can you come to that conclusion when I just read you a verse that says it does? How can anybody come to the conclusion that baptism's not a part of the salvation process if they believe that 1 Peter 3:21 was inspired by the Holy Spirit of God? And we understand, hopefully, that theologically they have rejected those things because they don't want to believe that the act of baptism that God has put in place has any part in the salvation process. This is an example, I believe, especially if you're sharing with your friends that don't believe in baptism, that you can help them to see the importance of baptism to the Jews in the first century who were not even being baptized for the right reasons, but were being baptized in order to cleanse their body to make their way into the presence of God. We could talk about sprinkling and pouring. This is the very word in Greek that would have been used that's translated into the English word baptism. If we want a definition of the English word baptism, just look at exactly how it was used and the way that it was used in the first century. It was immersion, not a pouring or a sprinkling, but an entire body being immersed in water. And so God, like many things that he used, you remember that he used Jesus as the Passover lamb to describe what the Passover lamb did in the Old Testament. We understand that Jesus is the scapegoat for our sins, as you see in the Old Testament. The immersion of the physical body to be physically cleansed was used in the New Testament and by Christians as a part of the salvation process. Not for the physical cleaning of the flesh, but as an answer of a good conscience towards God, 1 Peter 3:21. All right, I got a few minutes for any comments or questions that anybody might have about this area. Yes, sir. Not that I'm aware of, no. No restrooms that I'm aware of. I'm not sure what the process was. I could share with you, having visited a third world country about 30 years ago, that they didn't have any modern day toilet systems, and so there was a ditch that was dug on the side of the road, and that was used as their sewer system. That was just 30 years ago. So I imagine that they probably in the first century had something similar, designated areas that were used, not a public restroom area like we would think of. Any other comments or questions? All right, southern steps of the temple complex. I think it's a very important, theologically speaking, a very important area in understanding this idea about baptism and what Peter was saying in 1 Peter 3:21. Sadly, much of the diagrams, as I showed you already, don't depict these mikvot that are located on the southern steps. Why that is, I don't know. Could it be that denominational people are heading up these excavations and these drawings? I don't know the answer. It could be that because they've been more recently located or discovered, that people who had been taught prior to that believed that that was just an open area, and so they continue thinking that process. But as you can see from the photos I've shared with you, as you can see from the pictures that I shared with you, it was not the case that that was an open area, but a multitude of mikvot that were located in that area. Yes, ma'am. So there was farming outside of the city, and certainly there was the olive business was very lucrative. The grape business, fruit of the vine, was very lucrative. Many of these people had different businesses that they would have in the city itself. So you had business owners, and then those that were of the lower class would work in labor functions. Remember, Herod had to use labor to build all of this, so certainly normally they would use slave labor because then they don't have to pay for anything. So, but we don't know, or I don't know off the top of my head how much of the building of the temple. There were other areas besides the temple that Herod built. I showed you Masada, that was built by Herod the Great, and there were some other areas as well. So he did a lot of building during his reign, and certainly he would have used manual labor to accomplish that. All right, no more questions. We'll go ahead and close. We got 40 seconds anyway. So let's close with a prayer, and then you'll be dismissed before our worship service. Let's bow together. God, we're grateful for the things that we learn about that can help solidify our faith. We pray, Father, that as we study these things and put real-life photographs and videos to the things we read about in Scripture, that we can make application in our lives. Help us, Father, as we strive to look at where Jesus and the footsteps in Israel and in Jerusalem, that we would try spiritually to walk in the footsteps of Jesus as well. We offer this prayer and pray these things in His name, Jesus the Christ.